Yes. So we're gonna spend the second half of our time today talking about core teams. You may or may not have heard that phrase. I'm sure that you have an inkling of what it means. But that group of folks that are gathered around you who are, I heard someone describe it as weight-bearing team members who will help you and co-create with you, co-imagine with you, and co-lead with you in turning this vision of new community into a reality. And Tom, I'm hoping you'll speak up a little bit here, but this is one of the things that you and I have talked about as being one of the most crucial ingredients to the sustainability of a new community, and maybe one of the indicators about whether a new community is going to take off or not. What have been some of your observations?
Thank you, Katie, for asking. We have this idea that we can't prove it empirically, but we have this intuitive sense that if you look at all of the sectors of our US cultures, and try to see which ones are growing the fastest, we have an odd category to hold up in front of you today. And it's the number of people who have no prior experience with healthy community. Instead, they have experiences with what people have called pseudo community or abusive community or outright false community. And so when we use the language of community or even teams or working together, it evokes a very particular, as you were saying, Katie, Pavlovian response in them. So even to read the Christian Jewish scriptures and hear about, there's one body and we're all members of that same body and so forth, a lot of that language is really lost on people today. They don't have an etymology. They don't have a language for what we're describing. And so instead, what they need is embodiment, and they need symbols and examples of what it looks like to respect the dignity of every human being in measurable, meaningful ways that change lives all around us. So as we've worked with seminarians and then clergy and lay leaders across the church, often what we'll notice is they're really good with words, but the words don't have much impact, primarily because the people that they're trying to engage have no way of relating to the words. They might as well speak a foreign language until they begin holding up examples. And so we began talking about this three-ring circus, kind of a funny way of saying we need people at varying levels of being able to model what these behaviors Jesus was talking about really look like in real time on the ground in this particular community. That's what brings me to this conversation, Katie.
That's beautiful. And we've talked a good bit, and I'm sure that you all have some examples you could unmute and speak up and share, or throw in the chat box of ways that you've seen people maybe exhibit some behaviors that reveal how little experience of healthy community they have actually had, or how little experience of healthy church community they have actually had. These are some of those hidden behaviors and assumptions, the very consumerist-minded behaviors, the use of you language. That was a hard one to break in my church plant. Katie, I have an idea that you could carry out. And it took a long time to begin breaking some of those, to say, if we're going to commit to this together, then one of the ways that we exhibit that is to use we language, or when it's appropriate, I language. I like these in the chat box. Yes, over-functioning, making assumptions, under-functioning. That's great. You see those opposites. Another that we experienced a good bit was ghosting. Everybody know what that is? It's we're going to get to this when we talk about dissent and inviting dissent when it's needed. And many folks not, because they've never been invited to dissent, they disappear. Oh gosh, conflict, mismanagement, all that kind of family system stuff of recreating past church experiences. This is great. Gawain, ability to handle tension. Maybe the opposite would be the inability to handle tension. Yeah, not understanding church isn't a solo project. Allison, I like this. Yeah, how much is this the US with its emphasis on individualism?
Inability to speak from the heart, holding the cards close to the vest, to use that old expression, not yet trusting community.
Yes, avoiding conflict, sulking when you don't get what you want. I might have done a little bit of that.
I like this idea of like paradoxical, what is it called? A paradoxical relationship where you want to deeply be known, but you don't share or be vulnerable in the way for yourself to be known.
Yeah, that's great, Katie. So the desire is there, but the practice hasn't become clear yet. And so Tom just mentioned this, this 3-ring circus model of core teams and leadership. I've actually got a little doodle of this that I did. I'm going to screen share it with you here. And there we go. 3-ring circus model of leadership. And actually it was making more sense in my mind to do it as this little, what would you call that, a spiral? Maybe it's a 3-ring spiral of leadership, because those concentric circles are never quite closed. And actually who was I talking with right before this session started? Now I don't see your picture on here, about the intentional community. Who was that? Up in Michigan.
Was that me?
Oh, that was you, Judith. Yeah. We were talking a little before the session started about how important it is to have people gathered around you, the church planter, in the middle of this spiral here, who know how to model the practices and behaviors of a healthy community. So Katie Ernst, you were talking about folks who long to be seen and to be known, and yet don't necessarily have those practices or know those practices of being vulnerable. People to look for and nurture for a core team, right, might be those who do know what some of the practices of being vulnerable might be and how to model those for the wider community. And Tom, I think we talk about, please jump in, the church planter and the people, that core team that you gather around you, you could almost imagine them as being kind of in the center of this spiral. And they begin to model these practices for the next ring out. Maybe those are the folks that are not part of the core team, but commit to showing up and participating weekly in your new thing.
And it touches on that idea that not only are we modeling, but we're mentoring others in learning those behaviors. And we make promises about the durability of our commitment to each other in community, but most of the time it's sort of like a high ropes course. A really good trainer on a high ropes course will say, go ahead and test your safety line by jumping off. And you'll see right away, you can't go anywhere. You can't hurt yourself. You will not fall off. And then get back on and let's do the high ropes thing together. And there's a sense of that emerges when the core team is not only willing to mentor, but actually has been mentored. So when you ask great people about how their ability to bring a group of people along with them on a difficult journey, ask them, who mentored you? Or where did you learn this? And they'll usually describe a setting where they learned in the safety, lots of safety nets and fail-proofing, where they could make mistakes and not feel shame. They could try new things and not be embarrassed when it didn't go the way they thought it would. In other words, their heart learned to relax with being who they really are. And that piece of mentoring is lost on so many of our church leaders because we inherited a tradition that is so brain-centered, it doesn't think in behavioral terms. So we've even taken a behavioral covenant like the baptismal covenant, and we've turned it into a statement of belief. It's not, it's a behavioral covenant. It's all about how we treat each other. So the core team has not only been mentored, but they are now ready. There's a maturity, a depth of perception, a gravitas to their invitation. We can mentor you. Come join us. You ready? So there's the core. And then that second ring, you want to talk about it, Katie?
I love that. Right. And so that core team has been mentored, right? And then continues to mentor those folks, right? Those are the ones who maybe they show up. They show up weekly, not necessarily at worship, but however your community has discerned that it presents itself to the world, who then mentor those who maybe are on the a little bit more on the edge. You know, am I part of this community? Am I not? Am I dabbling in it? But what are those behaviors and ways of belonging, and right ways of being human and respecting, gosh, in that baptismal covenant, right? Respecting the dignity of every human being. What does that look like? And how is this new community mentoring it? And then maybe this largest circle or section of the spiral out here is the neighborhood as a whole. One of the things that we noticed at the Abbey, my church plant here in Birmingham, for the first 4 years of its life, the Abbey ran a coffee shop business. And it just so happened that we were in a part of town where there's just a number of folks who live on the streets, some by day and some by night as well. People in addiction, rehab right around the corner. And so we got lots of requests for free cups of coffee, as you can imagine. And it was something that I was actually very unsure how we were going to handle. And it was our baristas who began to model the practice of radical hospitality for me, and for those who came and worshiped at the Abbey. And the next thing you know, probably 6 months later, after our baristas had started a practice of giving 1 free cup of coffee to any guest in need each day, that we noticed that the coffee shop across the street was doing the same thing. And I'd like to think that that was actually a practice of modeling how we were going to engage with the neighborhood. And it's cool. They weren't stealing our business or our customers or anything. But they had hit on, oh yeah, this is how we're gonna interact with our neighbors. So I've actually taken this 3 rings and filled it out for you a little bit more here. What behaviors and practices do you want to see modeled in your new Episcopal community from your core team outwards? And I'd love to invite us, I know this is just in my raggedy handwriting, but it's just to kind of show you how this works. I'd love to invite us to brainstorm just a little bit here in this large group, and then we'll break off into some small groups about what those practices might be that you would like your core team members to help you model. Some of the ones that I have listed up here are up at the top here, showing up regularly, just that ministry of showing up. Using biblical ways and practices to resolve conflict. Let's see, engaging with neighbors outside the church, flexibility, sharing my gifts with the wider community. What else would you add to this? Feel free to use the chat box, or if a few folks want to unmute, please go ahead. The practice, I'm seeing trust, listening, faithfulness to their word and commitments. Jan, I actually wonder if you'd be willing to unmute and say a little bit more about what you're visioning with that.
Yeah, I think so. One of the features that I've seen in really unhealthy communities has been either lackadaisical or actively negligent approach to when we say we're going to do or be something, not following through and not being accountable to the wider community in reneging on that commitment. And I think that's a practice that I think needs to be cultivated. Community, being true to your word.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Some others, let's see, presumption of goodwill, kindness to newcomers, and curiosity. Steve, partying. Say more about partying.
I just think that the work can be so intentional sometimes and so important, and I mean that in really good ways, but we can also suck the life out of it sometimes in terms of remembering that this is a work of bringing community together, which is always joyful. So how are we intentional about how we celebrate, how we plan to be festive, how are we practicing lightness of being together as much as we are the intentionality of building a community. And so, being able to laugh at our errors, being able to celebrate even when things don't go perfect, what was working, like just paying attention to the positive, paying attention to the possibilities.
It's great. I think I would throw shared leadership in there somewhere. The Abbey, one of the ways that we held our Sunday community together was we had a GroupMe app. So just, very large text chain of ongoing conversation. And one of the things I found early on was I was the only one who would ever initiate a conversation on that GroupMe. And I really needed a core team member who would be willing to model the practice of posing a check-in question, right? Maybe on Monday mornings or Tuesday mornings. And so I talked to Gerald, who is someone who is just great at nurturing community and offering that kind of check-in, shows up on social media and said, Gerald, every now and then you're willing to do this. Would you do it more often so that other members of the community know that they can initiate a conversation? It doesn't have to, it doesn't always have to be the priest, right? And it helped. There were all of a sudden dozens of people who would just throw in something or post a picture. All right, so keep this image in mind. I think you can all sort of replicate that curly Q. And we're going to continue this conversation and hopefully take it a little bit deeper in some small groups. So the question remains, the question itself remains the same. What are some of those behaviors and practices that you want your core team members to model? And then if you were, I know that there are some folks who haven't started their new Episcopal community yet, but if you have, or if there's another community that maybe you've been a part of in the past, what are the behaviors that your team is doing pretty well at? And what might need a little work? The small groups, maybe if you want to throw those in the chat box or anything that might be helpful to express to the wider group or share, just throw